Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 5th European Space Generation Workshop. We're very happy to have with us today Mike Curtis-Rouse from the Satellite Applications Catapult, and I'm really pleased to introduce you to him because I'm actually working there in his team now. And today, Mike is going to be talking about the moon is not the next stop, nor is Mars. And Mike Curtis-Rouse, he's the head of manufacturing for space, so he does all things related with the upstream space, so from build, launch, in-orbit servicing, manufacturing, and I'm sure that he has plenty of very interesting things to tell us about. We will have some Q&A at the end, so please don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A option in Hopin, and the floor is yours, Mike.
Laura, thank you very much. Pilar, also thank you very much. And thank you to the Space Generation Advisory Council for the invitation to present this afternoon. My slight apologies, I was meant to be in somewhere with excellent Wi-Fi and great surroundings, and instead I'm sitting in a McDonald's car park, thanks to the wonderful delights of the UK's traffic system. However, if it all goes wrong, I'm sure someone will tell me. So once again, I'm Mike Curtis-Rouse. I'm head of manufacturing for space for the Satellite Applications Catapult. And this is about, well, the moon is not the next step. So let's crack on. So when we talk about space, the current rhetoric which generally comes is very much about we're going to the moon next. The next 3 to 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7, 8 years are all about going to the moon and potentially going beyond that. And what I want to talk about is why I don't think the moon is the next destination for, certainly not for humanity as a whole, and certainly not probably for your generation, my generation to an extent, and future generations to come. The moon is a hopping stone, but it's definitely not really the next stop. So NASA put together these wonderful slides, and I steal these with absolutely no shame, showing how they expect the exploration of the moon to take place over the next few years. And many of you will have seen what is termed as the Integrated Exploration Manifest. It's basically a fairly long series of words for what is a plan. The plan between 2019 to 2024. And actually, you can see that this plan goes well beyond 24. It goes up to 2028. And it's all about taking cargo, taking people, and ultimately establishing a human base on the moon, going well beyond what Apollo aspired to do. However, NASA, other agencies, the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, Chinese Space Agency, and many others, they all talk about the moon being but one step. And then after that, there is another step, which is ultimately going to Mars. So everyone is probably familiar with the rhetoric. I'm sure if they're not, then they probably are not on this planet. From Elon Musk and others talking about the need to go to Mars, the need to do things on Mars, the need to take humanity there to secure our survival as a species in some respects. But ultimately, in the same way the moon can offer us relatively little, Mars can't offer us much more. It certainly can offer us an awful lot of real estate, but it doesn't necessarily offer us anything useful beyond that. And that's why we need to go further. And that's why the moon isn't the next stop, and Mars certainly is not the next stop either. So I'm a big fan of sci-fi, but I like to revert to sci-fi, which I believe actually is likely to become reality rather than just stay pure fiction. And right now, I think some of the best series that you can see on Netflix or Amazon is probably The Expanse. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it. Some of you are fans of it. Some of you are not. However, most people who see it, the one thing you can generally say unilaterally is that it's pretty accurate. And The Expanse talks about the belt. Talks about the Kuiper belt, it talks about the asteroid belt, it talks about the belt being a source of resource. And that is exactly what it is. The asteroid belt is probably, more than anything, really going to be our next stop. So why is it going to be our next stop? What's so important about it? What's so important about the asteroid belt that the moon and Mars can't offer? Well, fundamentally, it's about resource. And there's a great analog that we can now actually draw. And that's effectively when we look at effectively the European colonization of North America, recognizing that, of course, there was already an indigenous population in North America. However, that didn't stop the big states within Europe. The United Kingdom of Great Britain as it was, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and many other nations, seeing North America basically as an enormous set of resource. Once it was explored, once it was discovered, suddenly there was this huge flow of product coming from North America. And you can see it on this chart, basically, some of the products coming out, everything from sugar, cod, rum, tobacco, cotton, sugar, and a variety of other products. And likewise, going into North America, manufactured goods. Now, this is a really, really good synergy in terms of comparing where we are today and where we potentially will go with the asteroid belt. So why is that? Well, fundamentally, it comes down to a couple of things. Firstly, it's about transport. The only way that we could ultimately explore North America was by basically having the sailing ships to get there. And once we were there, the ability to deploy effectively steam engines, the railway, to get across North America. Yes, of course, many of you would have seen effectively horses, the Wild West, all of the typical parlances in terms of exploration of North America was done by horse, was done by wagon, etc. But ultimately, it was the railway which made North America really, really accessible. The ability to build a railway, and you can see in the lower left-hand image of this, basically a hand-powered railway wagon, which is basically being propelled by the people using it. You build your railway, you move forward. And we can draw on this as a very similar analogy in terms of where we are in terms of the new space age, where we're going. New transportation becoming available, allowing us to get somewhere. And once there, why do we want to be there? Well, ultimately, it comes down to this. The asteroids offer us a huge degree of wealth that neither Mars nor the Moon can potentially offer us. Now, I do acknowledge that the Moon has about 600 million tons of water on it, contained in ice, and Mars probably does as well. However, unless we're using them basically as stepping stones and we're taking advantage of the low gravity wells of both of the planets and using that to hop off those respective satellite and planet, taking advantage of the fact that smaller delta V means that we can get into orbit faster, the reality is there isn't, at least thus far, a huge amount of usable resource on either the Moon or on Mars. But in the asteroid belt, we know there is plentiful resource. And in the same way in North America, the North American colonization was heavily driven, not so much by the presence of buffalo or later the presence of oil, but it was fundamentally driven by the presence of gold. Humanity have an obsession with gold. North America apparently had the plains lined with gold, as South America had cities of gold. And that's where the nations went, because gold was a commodity that was wanted, partially because it's precious, partially because it's useful. In fact, ironically, in the 21st century today, we probably have more use for gold in our semiconductors and our phones and our cars and our planes than we do in terms of wearing it as jewelry on our hands or around our necks. So when we look at what we can do with the asteroids, basically, the asteroids are presenting themselves as potentially the best mining site in the solar system for us. They're giving us the ability to go there and collect a variety of materials. Now, ice is probably, again, still one of the most significant aspects about the asteroids, and it offers the most significant potential. So we know from ice, we can effectively make rocket propellant. We can split it into oxygen and hydrogen. Naturally, by splitting it, we can create breathable air. At the same time, we can create water. Effectively, rocket propellant, water and air, and we can pretty much go anywhere. Of course, add to that on top of, we can use that to grow food. And finally, with a sufficient ice or sufficient water, more importantly, we can use that as radiation shielding, which means we really can go anywhere. Too many people often forget that the reality is if you want to explore the solar system, then you're going to need to be in a position where you can protect yourself, shield yourself, and ensure that if you do go somewhere, you arrive there intact, not with serious cancers and radiation burns from effectively the harsh reality of the space environment. So ice is going to be fundamentally critical. Of course, there's a variety of other materials we know in the asteroids we can use. And we're not talking realistically gold and the platinum group metals. We're talking some more simplistic materials, aluminiums, irons, which we can use to make steel, nickels, coppers. The fundamental materials that we built our civilization with, we can use again to build our civilization as we move into space proper. We can't get most of those minerals on the Moon. We certainly will struggle to find many of those on Mars. But we know there are asteroids already which are rich in materials, which can be identified, which can be effectively targeted, mined, extracted, and then we can do something with that material. Now, I talked about transportation earlier, and I'm a big fan of rockets. Lara will tell you that I spend a lot of my time being extremely enthusiastic about rocket propulsion, and one of the facilities we operate and we are developing right now is all about developing rocket propulsion in the UK and creating the test sites, etc. But building rockets is hard, but that doesn't stop people. So obviously, SpaceX have effectively performed engineering miracles, but not without failure. Other people have built a variety of rockets in the desert. Some of you, I'm sure, have flown your own. Other organizations like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries have had even harsher failures. I think it's probably fairly distressing when your rocket doesn't even achieve takeoff and explodes on the pad. But that hasn't stopped an awful lot of companies moving forward. What I find fascinating is that 10, 11 years ago, there were about 12 launch vehicle companies globally. Now, in the databases that myself and others monitor and track, we're in the region of 302. In fact, as of yesterday, it was 303 launch vehicle companies globally. This, if you can imagine, is the equivalent of the railway in the Wild West. These are the sailboats of the 21st century, which were the sailboats in the 19th century and the 18th century and before that. Our launch vehicles allow us to get to space. As Carl Sagan said, once you're in space, you're halfway to anywhere. So if we get there, we can go places, and we can go places, we can do things. And what I propose is, it's not about going to the moon, and it's not about going to Mars. Those are almost side attractions on the way. It's about going to the belt. The Allied Market Research Group put forward this study a couple of years ago, and they estimated that by 2025, the global asteroid mining market is expected to reach in the region of $4 billion. Now, we're not there yet, but actually, I don't think we're that far off from seeing some of our early missions docking with asteroids, looking to do extraction, and looking to start to exploit that capability. I suspect the reality is that in the longer term, there will almost certainly be an aspect that, I have small children running around me, just bear with me 1 second. There is almost certainly a possibility that we will see some of this exploitation in the longer term. However, hitting by 2025, I think, is too early, but I suspect certainly by 2030, we will see significant exploitation and utilization of the asteroid belt. But of course, this is dependent on a couple of other factors as well. Firstly, technology, the ability to effectively locate asteroids, the ability to identify asteroids and extract material from them, and then more importantly, being able to refine that material into something which is fundamentally useful, and then be able to effectively return that back to Earth, or to low Earth orbit, or to the moon, or to Mars. So while effectively the asteroid is the resource belt, it is the supermarket, effectively, of the solar system. It's not necessarily the place where we will do things. So that's probably why Mars, the moon, potentially Venus, and potentially other planets, and even asteroids themselves, they become the locations we do things, or whether we just do those things purely in space at one of the Lagrange points, for example. But organizations like Redwire and others who have acquired Made in Space and other organizations I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and some of you probably almost certainly work for, these organizations are very rapidly doing an assimilation of capability, the capabilities necessary to create this technology for survey, for detection, for extraction, and for utilization. However, technology is no good without the people. And fundamentally, when we talk about people, we're not just talking about the bold few that NASA periodically portrays of having highly qualified, highly diverse individuals, but probably not numbering no more per astronaut class of between 20 to 30. We're talking about needing an entire generation. And this is realistically where it comes back to potentially those of you who are listening to me. We're looking at effectively a generation who can provide engineers and scientists and economists, people who can do construction, people who can do extraction, people who can do a whole myriad of other tasks, administration, project management, finance, health and safety, a whole variety of functions. And to do that, we're not going to need a few dozen people. We're going to need hundreds. And the reality is hundreds still won't suffice. The probability is, in order for humanity to actually be able to fully exploit the solar system, in order for humanity to go beyond the moon, go beyond Mars, and get to the belt, because that's realistically where the gold is, and there is no pun intended in that respect. That is where the resource is, which allows us to truly exploit what we can do within the solar system. We are going to need thousands, and those thousands of people are going to be people like you. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Sorry about the introductions of small children roaming around me. Lara, back to you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was really, really interesting and very inspiring as well. So we are going to jump to the Q&A now. We have the first question that is asking about how would you propose we regulate the supermarket of the solar system in terms of upsetting the market of these raw materials on Earth?
Well, I think the reality is that is exactly what is going to happen. I doubt there is going to be any real regulation. And if you look at the first time that any nation attempts to colonize or explore a new resource, there was almost certainly a market upset. However, there's going to be a balance, because clearly extracting resource from the asteroid belt there's going to be relatively few elements, I suspect, there which would come back to Earth necessarily. Perhaps if everyone does want to drive an electric car, then we're going to need an awful lot of rare earth elements. But if you put aside the fact that REEs can be found on Earth as well as in the belt, the reality is I think most material will end up in orbit or in close proximity to the belt. So from a regulation perspective, I don't think it will realistically upset the global markets, at least the global markets for Earth. It may well upset the global markets for other planets in due course, but I don't think, sadly, we're there yet.
And it's probably not going to be only for coming back to Earth, right? Like those resources, as you're saying, they're going to be exploited and used in space.
Absolutely. If we want to go further and we want to go beyond the belt, we're not going to have the ability to build giant spacecraft and spaceships which allow us to take the material from Earth and effectively go further. Now, there was some speculations that we could build effectively on Mars something akin to the Star Trek Utopia shipyards on Mars, etc., and use the relatively lower gravity to get us further and beyond. But I think the reality is, and I suspect many people think the reality is if you're going to build spacecraft which are going to go distance, and by that I mean either within the solar system or beyond the solar system, you're not going to build them on a planetary body or even a satellite. You will build those structures in space, and you will extract the materials needed to build those structures in space from space.
Amazing. So the idea in terms of phases, if we have to choose, do you think it's going to be, the Moon, Mars, and then the belt then? Or like, would you think that there's going to be missions going straight to the belt and we don't really need to practice in the Moon or Mars, or actually trying and testing these technologies in the Moon and Mars would be interesting as well?
I think it's going to be super interesting. I'm just glad that I'm at least going to see it, and your generation's certainly going to see it in anger. I think it's going to start off being with a reasonably predictable narrative. We'll see NASA, we'll see China, and we'll see a few other agencies, maybe ESA as well, plus private organizations go to the moon. And then suddenly it will become a free-for-all. And I think we'll see a myriad of missions going to the belt. We'll see some missions going to Mars. My speculation is that SpaceX's aspirations for Mars may go very badly wrong. I think that Musk's ambition possibly outweighs their technological capability, at least today. But that doesn't mean they'll fail. But I'm not necessarily sure it will be his generation which gets there, or my generation, more to the point. Your generation, certainly. But the big question is why do we go to Mars? And it's not just about extending our species. It has to, and scientific exploration. There has to be a bigger reason to go there as well. Terraforming, I think, is too big an aspiration, certainly for this century. Maybe the next one.
So what do you think it's that objective then?
So, the objective going to Mars is ultimately, I think, just for scientific curiosity, almost a little bit to do in the same way that Edmund and Hillary climbed Everest. Why did they climb it? Well, they said it was there. Why did we go into space? Well, if you listen to JFK, because also it was there. Now, will we go to Mars because it's there? You know what? Humanity's pretty curious, pretty foolish at times as well. But we're pretty curious. So I suspect we'll go to a whole variety of planets in the solar system, not because we should, not because it's a good idea, but because we can. And there will almost certainly, the realistic side of space is that we'll also see in the next 2 decades, we will see plenty of fatalities and accidents. People will die doing these endeavors. But, if one thing has been proven is humanity is pretty resilient. And we don't tend to give up in the face of adversity. And adversity is one of those few things that really bind us, irrespective of race, religion, gender, nationality, and everything else, which really bind us together. So, you know what? If we're leaving the planet and we're going out to do more, that's probably only going to be good for the species as a whole, because there are a few other activities that we actually do which offer the same level of, I think, cohesion that exploring space does.
Amazing. A really, really exciting future that we have ahead. And as you were saying, hopefully our generation becomes a part of it and can contribute to it. And one of the questions we have is about the skills. What skills, they're listening from all over Europe and also all over the world. They're mostly students and young professionals that form the Space Generation Advisory Council. And yeah, the question is about the skills. What skills do you think are going to be needed, not only today, but also in the jobs of the future in space economy and in space activities that we're going to see?
So I think if nothing else, be curious, be robust, be at least reasonably fit, as in you can explore and do things outside. So if for those, space is a harsh environment, and even if you end up living in a tin can like a station, you still fundamentally end up with a challenge of having to deal with a contentious, difficult environment. So being reasonably robust. And that doesn't need to necessarily mean that you need 2 arms and 2 legs and 2 eyes. It means that you have the ability to do a variety of things. So firstly, that. Secondly, confidence in your own ability. Thirdly, a specialism to an extent in something. Now, right now, we have astronauts who have specialisms in ceramics, in metallurgy, in biology, in orbital mechanics. In the future, we're going to need specialists in just about everything. And I suspect some of the most popular people in space are going to be people who, for example, can cook, or can ensure that your showers function. So, you know, if I draw on another analogy, if you look at some of our Antarctic bases, which most of the nations have an involvement in, on those bases, the most important people aren't actually the principal scientists. They tend to be the engineers who keep the plumbing working, which keep the showers running, the water flowing, the person who runs the bar. So in some respects, while I'm not proposing necessarily that if you want to find a good future in space, be awesome at mixing cocktails, you know what? It's probably going to stand you in pretty good stead if you can, because it's the little things which make these societies and these bubbles of humanity effectively function well. So find yourself a subject. It doesn't necessarily need to be explicitly a subject which is being used today, but look ahead. So is it going to be expertise in understanding how you basically control friction in space? Really tough one. Mechanisms are a real pain. Tribobiology is a complex subject. So how do you manage that? Or, for example, what about if you have a good understanding of how to keep solar cells clean and photovoltaics? So that might be another area. Power electronics, batteries. But then there's a whole other series of aspects, managing people in adverse circumstances. So those of you who like talking to people, who like counseling, I can guarantee that those factors are going to be things which are going to be in demand. So reality is, I would suggest be reasonably fit, have a specialism in something, and also have something which is almost completely contrary to it. So be a great chef, be able to fix plumbing, know how to keep somewhere clean, be great at basically taking people's teeth out with very few tools, those sort of things.
Great. I think those are great advices also for lots of our young professionals that are probably applying for being astronauts, but not only in the technical side, I guess that also like business analysts and people that are going to stay on Earth supporting this economy as well.
Yeah, space is not just about engineers and scientists and doctors. Space is about everything. If you wanted to build a society somewhere else on Earth, you wouldn't just take engineers, doctors. In the past, we would have taken soldiers. Let's hope that we don't have to do it in the future, but we will probably have to take a degree of law enforcement. With any form of exploration, you usually find a criminal fraternity sooner or later popping up, because there's opportunity, and where there's opportunity, there's crime, which is great, which means we probably need law enforcement as well. So for any of you who are aspiring to be space police, there's probably an opportunity out there as well.
Great, thanks, Mike. We have another one that asks about the expectation. So when do you think this will become a reality? Many space mining companies are struggling financially now. So is this a 50 plus years away or more recent? How far away? You mentioned before 2030s.
I reckon we will see the first asteroid docking rendezvous and initial mineral sampling before the end of this decade. I know that's a pretty bold statement, but I reckon that by 2040, we will see in situ resource utilization, both in the belt or in asteroids which are close to Earth, which are effectively in proximity to the Earth, and certainly on the Moon. I don't think we're going to see a big deal around ISIU for Mars, but certainly for lunar, for ice, and for asteroids in close proximity to Earth. I mean, hopefully small ones we know about. I'm a big fan of those. Being able to find those and do something with those, I think by the end of this decade, we will see it. I think right now, I was talking with a colleague this afternoon about nuclear propulsion in space, and talking about where things might be in 2027. So, for example, I think by 2027, we will see lunar operations by a variety of nations, not just the United States, not just the European Space Agency, probably China as well, on the Moon. I think we will start to see some seriously big probes going towards Mars, making things like Perseverance look like, in some cases, small toys. We'll almost certainly see initiatives in terms of in-orbit servicing and manufacturing. Northrop Grumman will continue with mission extension vehicles. We'll see on-orbit manufacturing and some early return to Earth or product. And that will basically stall several times before people start finding those niche products which we can make in space and use on Earth. And that will really start getting the economy moving. And at the same time, private astronauts, commercial space stations, space tourism, and a whole bunch of probably fairly horrific accidents, just to provide some context, I suspect will be happening at the same time. So right now, my observation is things are happening a hell of a lot faster than we thought they were. This is the reboot of Apollo by a factor of 10. And it's being driven by the commercialization of space. not understanding our cosmic origins in the universe, not understanding whether there's life under the next rock or whether there's protomolecules floating in the upper atmospheres. This is about looking for commercialization of product we can take from space, make in space, and use in space.
Yep, an amazing future, very exciting. One of the questions is, are you suggesting that the work on asteroids will be completely by humans, astronauts, or would it be machines to larger scale, Robert?
So my general opinion is, and if there are any astronauts listening to this or aspiring astronauts, please don't be offended, but astronauts, in my view, are highly trained monkeys, highly trained curious monkeys who tend to drop things and lose things. So you know what? Astronauts absolutely will be in play, but I think in the next 10 years, 15 years, we'll stop calling them astronauts. We'll call them space workers or something like that. In the same way that, if you went to colonize a new nation, you were called a colonist originally, and then after a while, people would just say, you just happen to live here. And I think we'll get to the same level. Astronauts are specialists, but they're a specialist for, I guess, this century. But in the next century, I don't think we'll be talking. In fact, I'm not sure in the next decade we'll be talking about astronauts. I think it will change. In terms of operations, I think it's going to be a hybrid. It will be a combination of machines, systems, robotics, some autonomous, some more manual, and people in the loop as well. I think there'll be a heavier focus towards machines, but you know what? No one's yet managed to build a machine which can basically have the same dexterity and imagination that a human has. And I can't see that being replaced, whether you believe in things like the singularity or not, happening anytime soon, if ever. So don't worry, you've all still definitely got jobs.
Another question that we have, and probably the last one, is sending a piece of tech to mine somewhere without gravity even practical? A space station with controlled gravity, maybe? Mining and manufacturing there would be easier, no?
Yes and no. I mean, if you think about it, you're right. There's no gravity. Well, there's gravity everywhere. It's just in different proportions. But once you get to a location and you can basically attach to it, if you can attach yourself to an asteroid, then actually you can do mining, and you don't really need to worry about the impact of gravity. You do need to think about basically how you basically remove material and where that material goes. So throwing big chunks of dirt over your proverbial shoulder is probably a really bad idea, because it's going to probably come back around and hit you fairly imminently. But I'm pleased if anyone's got any suggestions here. I'm all ears. But I think we place too high a dependency on gravity when actually its absence can be our ally, while its presence also can be our ally. We just need to work out how to use it in different circumstances. One of the activities that Lara and I are involved in, for example, is building an orbital docking simulator in the UK. So if there's anyone aspiring out there who has any ideas how to build one, we'd love to know, because we need to work that one out fairly soon.
Yep, we do. All right, and the last one is, do you think that clean initiatives on Earth, such as reusability or recycling, are being sidelined by the thought of getting resources elsewhere?
Yeah, a little bit, but I think right now most people who can realize that we can take things from space and use things on Earth, they're in a pretty small minority. I think what I see more of is people getting really excited about trying to recycle satellites and defunct objects in space and use them for other things. I think that is a misnomer, because once something's been in space for any long lengthy duration, aluminums, composites, foils, plastics, etc., tend to become heavily degraded. So I don't think Earth needs to worry about realistically any issues about we're going to stop recycling because there's a whole bunch of stuff we can take from the asteroids, etc. But I do think we need to be a bit more cynical about what we might be able to take from space and use in space.
Great. Wow. Thank you very much, Mike. I think we have an exciting future ahead. Everyone was thinking about the moon and Mars, and now you've opened up a new paradigm about the asteroid belt. And yeah, I think all these ice and other materials resources are definitely going to help us on the way to other outer space. And yeah, thank you so much. It was super exciting. And now we have another keynote, so we're going to need to say goodbye. But thanks a lot for being here with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks a lot.